The porch floorboards creaked under my weight, a familiar sound I hadn't heard in 2 years. I stood there, my duffel bag a heavy anchor at my feet, staring at the chipped green paint of my grandmother's front door. The house looked exactly the same, a steadfast New England colonial with black shutters and a stubborn refusal to acknowledge the passage of time. Inside my bag, nestled between rolled-up socks and a dog-eared copy of a medical journal, was a small velvet box. The bronze star inside felt less like an honor and more like a paperweight, pulling me down through the porch steps, into the soil beneath. I could already picture Alina on the other side of that door, probably in her favorite armchair, the one positioned to see anyone approaching. She'd have seen my taxi pull up. She'd be waiting. The silence from within was more unnerving than any incoming fire I'd faced. I'd patched up men with limbs hanging by threads, my hands steady as granite, but now, facing this door, a fine tremor started in my fingers. I curled them into a fist, pressing my knuckles against the rough wood of the doorframe. Composure. It was my armor, and I couldn't let it crack now, not here. Taking a deep breath that did little to settle the tightness in my chest, I reached for the brass knob. It was unlocked, just as it always had been. Another of Alina's unshakable beliefs: locks were for city folk. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Lemon polish and the faint, sweet scent of the rose sachets she tucked into the linen closet. It was the smell of my childhood, of safety, and for a dizzying moment, I was 10 years old again, coming home from school. The hallway was dim, the only light spilling from the living room archway. I dropped my bag by the umbrella stand, the thud too loud in the quiet house. "Elara," her voice came from the living room, thin but firm. It hadn't changed. "It's me, Graham." I walked into the room, and there she was. Alina Vance, 78 years old, sitting ramrod straight in her armchair, her hands folded in her lap. She was smaller than I remembered, the bones of her wrists more prominent under her delicate skin. But her eyes, the same sharp, clear blue as my own, held the same formidable strength. They scanned me from head to toe, a quick, clinical assessment. I saw the flicker of relief in them, instantly suppressed, replaced by a guarded stillness. "You're late. I expected you this morning," she said, her tone even, devoid of welcome. The flight was delayed out of Germany. Then there was traffic from Logan. I stood awkwardly in the center of the Persian rug, feeling like a guest. A large silver-framed photograph on the mantelpiece caught my eye, my grandfather, Robert, handsome and severe in his army dress greens, taken just before he shipped out for Vietnam. He never came back. His presence in this room was a ghostly third party to every conversation we'd ever had about my own service. "I see," she said. Her gaze drifted from my face to my bag in the hallway. "I made tea. It's probably stewed by now." "Tea sounds good," I said, though the thought of anything in my stomach made me queasy. She didn't move. Neither did I. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. It was the same silence that had descended 2 years ago, in this very room, a silence that had started with a shout. That day had been bright and unseasonably warm for early spring. I'd driven down from Fort Devens, my deployment orders sitting in my breast pocket, a piece of paper that felt like it was burning a hole through my uniform. I'd chosen to tell her in person, a decision that now, standing in the cold silence of my homecoming, felt naively optimistic. Sarah had been there, a buffer I'd stupidly thought I needed. She'd come over under the pretense of a casual visit, her presence a comforting constant. She was perched on the edge of the sofa, a mug of coffee cradled in her hands, her easy smile feeling more and more out of place as the moment of truth approached. Alina had been arranging a bouquet of tulips in a cut crystal vase. "Such a nice surprise, both of you here in the middle of the week," she'd said, snipping the end of a stem with precision. "Is everything all right at the base, Elara? You're quiet." This was it. I remember the feel of the starched fabric of my uniform against my skin, the weight of my captain's bars. I was 26 years old, a fully qualified medic, a leader of soldiers. But in that room, I felt like a child about to confess to breaking a window. "Graham, I have news," I began, my voice sounding too loud. "I've received my orders. My unit is deploying." The snipper stilled in her hand. She didn't look up, focusing intently on the tulips. "Deploying? Where to?" "Afghanistan, the Kunar province." I said it quickly, wanting to get the words out. The room went cold. Sarah shot me a worried glance, her smile vanishing. Alina carefully placed the snippers on the table. She turned slowly, and the look on her face, a mixture of sheer disbelief and dawning horror, struck me like a physical blow. "Absolutely not," she said, her voice low and final. "Graham, it's not a choice. It's my job." "Your job," she repeated, the words dripping with ice. "Your job is to be a medic, Alara, to tend to soldiers on a base, not to go gallivanting off to some godforsaken mountain range on the other side of the world." She swept a hand toward my grandfather's photograph. "I know what war is. I lived it. I lost my husband to it. It is no place for a woman. It swallows them whole and spits out what's left." The old argument, we'd had variations of it since I'd joined the army, but this was different. This was real. "It's not 1970, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, reasonable. "It's different now. Women serve, I'm trained, I'm good at what I do." "Good at what?" she fired back, her composure shattering. "At seeing young men blown apart, at holding their hands while they die. Do you think that's a calling? It's a nightmare, Alara, it's a curse, and you are walking right into it with your eyes wide open." Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "Eleanor, maybe we should all just take a breath. Alara is incredibly capable. She's one of the strongest people I know." Eleanor rounded on her, and for a second I saw the raw, unvarnished grief of the 26-year-old widow she had once been. "This isn't about strength, Sarah. This is about sense. It's about survival. Do you think I wasn't strong? I raised a daughter on my own after Robert died. I buried that daughter and her husband, and I raised their child." Her finger jabbed in my direction. "I did that. I held this family together. That is strength, not running toward the gunfire." Her words, meant to illustrate her own fortitude, felt like a dismissal of everything I was, everything I had chosen to become. The anger, hot and sharp, rose in my throat. Running toward the gunfire is exactly what I'm trained to do. Someone has to be there. Those boys, those men, they need medics. They need someone who won't freeze. I can help them. I can save lives. "You can't save everyone," she cried, her voice cracking. "And you will break yourself trying. Don't you understand? I will not lose you too." The last words were a desperate whisper, and they hung in the air between us, the true heart of the matter laid bare. It wasn't about principles or outdated notions. It was about fear. A deep, abiding terror forged in a telegram delivered 50 years ago. But in that moment, all I felt was the sting of her lack of faith. "You think I'm going to break? You think I'm not strong enough?" "I think war does not care how strong you are," she shot back, the fear morphing back into anger. "It takes. That is all it does. And you, with your medals and your duty, you are handing yourself over to it on a silver platter." I looked at Sarah, silently pleading for support, but she just looked pained, trapped between two worlds she didn't understand. She lived in a world of design software and client meetings, where the biggest risk was a missed deadline. She couldn't comprehend the pull of duty, the grim necessity of the path I'd chosen. Her silence felt like a betrayal. "I'm not handing myself over," I said, my voice dropping, turning cold and flat. The same tone I used to calm a panicked patient. "I am doing my duty. As a soldier and as a medic, my decision is made. I leave in 6 weeks." The finality in my voice extinguished the last of the fight in her. The anger drained from her face, leaving behind a pale, weary mask of resignation. She turned her back on me, picking up the vase of tulips. "Then you have made your choice," she said, her voice hollow. "And I have made my peace with the consequences." She walked out of the room and into the kitchen. I heard the vase being set down heavily on the counter. Sarah stood up, placing a hand on my arm. "She's just scared, Alara. Give her time." But time was the one thing that felt in short supply. The 6 weeks that followed were a study in tense coexistence. Eleanor went about her routines, gardening, church, her weekly bridge game, but the house was filled with a profound silence. She didn't mention my deployment again. She stopped asking about my preparations. It was as if I had already left, and she was simply waiting for the official confirmation. The memory faded, leaving me back in the present-day living room, the silence now 2 years older and infinitely heavier. "I'll put the kettle on again," Eleanor said abruptly, pushing herself up from her chair. She moved slowly, a hand braced on the armrest for support. It was a new gesture, one that spoke of a fragility she would never admit to. "Let me," I said, taking a step toward the kitchen. "I'm perfectly capable of boiling water," she replied, not unkindly, but with a firmness that erected an invisible barrier. She disappeared into the kitchen, and I was left alone with my grandfather's photograph. I looked at his young, serious face. Did he feel this chasm when he left? This cold distance that was worse than a shouting match? I had spent 2 years in a world of dust and blood and sheer, adrenalized purpose, clinging to the idea of home, of this house, of her, as a fixed point, a North Star. But the star had shifted. The home I'd carried in my head no longer existed, if it ever had. The days leading up to my departure had been a blur of packing and briefings. Sarah had insisted on driving me to the airport, a small mercy for which I was grateful. The morning I left was gray and drizzly. Eleanor stood with Sarah by the security line, her back as straight as a ruler, her face a carefully composed mask. She had hugged me stiffly, her body unyielding. The hug lasted less than a second. "Be careful," she'd said, the words clipped and formal. That was it. No, I love you. No, come home safe. Just a command, as if my safety were a matter of simple caution, like looking both ways before crossing the street. I'd nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and turned toward the security gate. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I walked through the scanner, collected my gear, and joined the stream of other soldiers heading to the gate. Their families were waving, crying, holding up handmade signs. I walked alone. On the transport plane, the roar of the engines was a welcome noise, drowning out the thoughts screaming in my head. I found a seat by a window, the plastic cool against my forehead. I pulled out my wallet and extracted a small, faded photograph tucked behind my ID card. It was me and Eleanor, taken on my graduation day from basic training. I was beaming, my arms slung around her shoulders. She was smiling too, a small, tight smile, but her eyes were proud. That pride felt like a lifetime ago. I stared at the photo until the lights of the Boston skyline disappeared beneath the clouds, wondering if the rift between us, stretched now across continents and oceans, would ever close, or if it would widen into a permanent void. Now, back in the house where that photograph was taken, the void felt more real than the furniture. I could hear the clink of a cup and saucer in the kitchen. The mundane sound was somehow terrifying. How do you bridge 2 years of silence? How do you explain the things you've seen, the person you've become, to someone who never wanted you to go in the first place? The metal in my duffel bag felt like a verdict, not a victory. It was proof that I had survived the very thing she feared most, but it was also proof that I had become a part of that world, a world she had spent a lifetime trying to keep at bay. And I had no idea how to tell her that a part of it had indeed come home with me. The dust was a fine, gritty film on everything, even on my tongue. It was the 14th month, and the initial shock of the place had worn off, replaced by a kind of weary familiarity. The forward operating base wasn't home, but it had become a bizarre sort of habitat, a collection of sandbags, HESCO barriers, and khaki tents humming with generators under a sky that was either bleached white with heat or bruised purple with dust storms. My sanctuary was the aid station, a reinforced tent we dubbed the patch-up shop. It smelled of antiseptic, sweat, and the faint, metallic tang of blood, a scent I'd learned to compartmentalize. The organized chaos of checking supplies was my morning ritual, a way to ground myself before the day could throw whatever it had at us. I was running my fingers over the neat rows of gauze, counting tourniquets for the 3rd time that morning, when Marcus Thorne's shadow fell across the supply table. "You counting them again, Vance?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that cut through the distant thrum of a Black Hawk. "I swear, if we get overrun by insurgents, you'll be more worried about the inventory sheet than the bullets." I didn't look up. "A misplaced tourniquet is a bullet you can't afford to miss, Sergeant." Spoken like a true bean counter with a medical degree. He slid a steaming metal mug onto the table next to my hand. The liquid inside was thick, black, and smelled vaguely of fuel. It was the closest thing to coffee we could get, and it was a small piece of heaven. I finally glanced at him. Marcus had the kind of face that seemed carved from the same rock as the surrounding hills, weathered, solid, with laugh lines around his eyes that were deeper than the worry lines on his forehead, but only just. At 32, he'd seen more than most people do in a lifetime, and it had left a permanent gravity in his gaze. But his mouth was always ready to twist into a wry smile, a defense mechanism I'd come to rely on. "Thank you," I said, wrapping my hands around the mug. The heat was a comfort, a real sensation in a place that often felt surreal. "Don't mention it. Figured you could use it. You've got that look." He leaned against the table, crossing his arms. His fatigues were already dusty, and it was only 800. What look? The I've been reading emails from home look. He took a sip from his own mug. The good kind, or the kind that makes you want to reorganize the entire medical supply depot. A dry chuckle escaped me. He saw too much. Eleanor. Ah, the Grand Inquisitor. What's the verdict from the homeland? Did she finally admit she misses you? I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen smudged with fingerprints. The email was brief, a few lines that felt like they'd been composed with the same effort as a grocery list. I read it aloud, my voice flat. Ilara, the weather is unseasonably cool. Mrs. Gable's rhododendrons won first prize at the county fair. The church bake sale raised $400 for the new roof. I hope you're being careful. Eleanor. Marcus was quiet for a moment, listening to the silence that stretched after her sign-off. $400 for a roof? What are they baking? Gold leaf cupcakes. It's not about the roof, Marcus. I sighed, locking the screen. It's about everything being exactly as she left it. The rhododendrons, the bake sales, the careful weather reports. It's her way of building a wall. If she doesn't talk about where I am, then maybe I'm not really here. Or maybe she's just telling you about her day, he said gently. Not everyone can articulate this. He gestured vaguely at the dust, the tense, the ever-present hum of anxiety. She can articulate plenty, she just chooses not to. I took a long swallow of the bitter coffee. What about you? Hear from your sister. His face softened. Yeah, pictures of my nephew. Kid learned to ride a bike, no training wheels. Looks like he's about to launch himself into orbit, but he's grinning like a maniac. He pulled out his own phone, showing me a photo of a small boy with Marcus's same wide smile, caught in a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. The contrast to my own screen, with its terse, emotionless text, was a physical ache in my chest. That's great, Marcus. I meant it. The genuine happiness in his voice was a tiny beacon in the gloom. It is. It's also a gut punch. Makes you wonder what you're missing, you know? He tucked the phone away, the moment of vulnerability passing as quickly as it had come. But then you remember why you're here. To make sure kids like him can keep learning to ride their damn bikes without worrying about IEDs on the way to the park. It was the mantra we all repeated, the justification we clung to. Some days it felt solid, true. Other days, like today, it felt thin, a fragile shield against the overwhelming doubt. Later that afternoon, the doubt was vaporized by sheer, unadulterated necessity. The radio crackled to life, a voice tight with urgency calling for medics. A patrol had hit an IED, mass casualties. The familiar adrenaline, cold and sharp, shot through my veins, silencing the noise in my head. This was what I was trained for. This was where the composure, the thing Eleanor saw as a coldness, became a lifeline. The world narrowed to the thumping rhythm of the medevac helicopter and the weight of my aid bag. We landed in a cloud of brown dust, the rotors whipping up a storm of sand and debris. The scene outside was chaos, shouting, the acrid smell of explosives and burning, the frantic movements of soldiers securing the perimeter. Then I saw my first patient. Private Miller, a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, was laid out on a stretcher. His leg was a ruin below the knee, a mess of shredded fabric, flesh, and splintered bone. His face was pale, beaded with sweat, his eyes wide with a terror that was too raw to be called shock. He was screaming, a high-pitched, continuous sound that was more animal than human. Miller, look at me. I dropped to my knees beside him, my voice cutting through his screams with a force that surprised even me. It wasn't loud, but it was absolute. Look at my eyes, son. You're not going to die today. Do you understand me? His gaze locked onto mine, desperate, searching for an anchor. I found it, the calm settling over me like a second skin. My hands moved without conscious thought, a well-rehearsed dance of trauma care. Tourniquet high and tight on the thigh. Check airway. Start an IV. My fingers were steady, my breathing even. I was aware of Marcus working beside me on another soldier, of the shouts and the roar of the helicopter, but it was all background noise. My universe was the pressure I applied, the vein I found, the words I spoke to Miller in a low, steady monotone. You're doing great, just keep looking at me. Breathe with me, in and out. I was a machine of efficiency, all emotion siphoned away to fuel the task. This was the duality. The more horrific the situation, the more still I became inside. It was the only way to win against the chaos. We loaded him onto the bird, his vitals stabilizing under my hands. As the helicopter lifted off, a staff sergeant clapped me on the shoulder, his face grim but respectful. "Good work, Captain. Saved that boy's life." I just nodded, the praise washing over me without sticking. There was no triumph, only a hollow exhaustion. Back at the fob, covered in dust and other men's blood, I scrubbed my hands until they were raw, the scent of antiseptic soap failing to erase the memory of copper and explosives. That night, I tried to write an email to Sarah, my childhood friend, the graphic designer with a life of client meetings and cozy apartment dinners. I started to tell her about Miller, about the dust, about the sound of the medevac. But my fingers froze over the keys. How could I possibly translate that reality into words she would understand? Her last email had been about a difficult client and a new recipe for quinoa salad she wanted to try. Our worlds had diverged so completely that the bridge between them felt like it was made of tissue paper. I deleted the draft and closed the laptop. The days bled into weeks. The emails from Alina continued, a litany of mundane details that felt like messages from another planet. Sarah's messages became less frequent, the gaps between them growing longer, the tone more strained, as if she'd finally given up trying to find common ground. The isolation wrapped around me, a second layer of dust. My only real conversations were with Marcus, during our shared moments over the terrible coffee. We were sitting on ammo crates outside the aid station one evening, the sky a spectacular canvas of orange and deep blue. The heat of the day was finally relinquishing its grip. "What's the first thing you're going to eat when you get back?" he asked, a classic Marcus diversion tactic. "A salad," I said without hesitation. "Something green and cold and crisp, with real lettuce, and a dressing that isn't oil and vinegar from a plastic bottle." He snorted. "You're crazy, I'm getting a steak, a big, bloody one, and a baked potato with all the fixings, and a beer. A cold, cold beer that doesn't taste like aluminum." I smiled, a real one this time. "That does sound good. What about your grandma? She a good cook?" I thought of Alina's kitchen, the smell of roasting chicken and rosemary. "She's traditional, meat and potatoes, everything from scratch. It's good, solid. Like her, I thought, solid and unmovable." "She'll probably have a feast waiting for you," he said. Maybe, I doubted it. I pictured my return, Alina standing stiffly in the doorway, her face a mask of controlled emotion. There would be no feast. There would be silence, a careful distance measured in inches that felt like miles. "I think it's going to be complicated." Marcus studied my face, because of the medal. I flinched. The recommendation had gone through, the Bronze Star, for valor during a particularly nasty engagement a month prior. The paperwork called it heroism under fire. I called it doing my job. The idea of it waiting for me at home felt like a lead weight. To Alina, it wouldn't be a symbol of honor. It would be a receipt for the danger I'd been in, a physical manifestation of everything she feared. "She'll see it as proof," I said quietly. "Proof that she was right to be afraid, that this place changes you." "It does change you, Alara," he said, his voice losing its usual banter. "That's not a bad thing. You don't walk through fire and come out the same. The trick is not to let it burn away the good parts." Before I could answer, the world exploded. It wasn't a distant thump this time. It was close. The concussion hit me in the chest, a physical blow that knocked the air from my lungs. The alarm screamed, a piercing wail that cut through the evening calm. In an instant, the base was a swarm of controlled panic. Rocket attack. Marcus was on his feet, grabbing my arm. "Aid station, now." We ran, our boots pounding on the hard-packed earth. The air whistled with incoming rounds, the impacts shaking the ground. We stumbled into the tent just as a blast hit nearby, the force ripping through the canvas walls. The world became a cacophony of screams, tearing metal, and the frantic crackle of the radio. The next few minutes were a blur of smoke and pain. A direct hit on the motor pool had sent shrapnel flying. Soldiers stumbled in, bleeding, dazed. I moved on instinct, my training, and that hard-won composure taking over completely. I barely registered the sting of a cut on my own cheek from flying debris. Then I saw him. A young private, Dawson, was pinned under a collapsed section of shelving, medical supplies scattered around him like grotesque confetti. A jagged piece of metal was protruding from his abdomen. His eyes were wide, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "Marcus, I need help here," I yelled, dropping to my knees beside Dawson. Marcus was across the tent, applying a pressure dressing to another soldier's arm. "I'm pinned here, Vance. You've got this." I was alone with him. The composure held, a cold, clear lens through which I assessed the situation. Airway clear. Breathing shallow, rapid. The shrapnel was in a bad place. If I pulled it, he could bleed out in minutes. If I left it, it could cause internal damage. I had to stabilize him for evacuation. "Dawson, look at me." My voice was calm, a stark contrast to the hell raging around us. His eyes flickered toward me, glazed with shock. "I need you to stay with me. We're going to get you out of here." My hands worked, packing gauze around the wound, trying to stabilize the foreign object without displacing it. I started an IV, my fingers finding a vein despite his trembling. The tent was hot, filled with the smell of dust, blood, and smoke. Sweat dripped into my eyes, stinging. I could hear Marcus shouting orders, the whump of a nearby generator catching fire, the relentless scream of the alarm. But in the small space around Dawson, there was only his ragged breathing and the sound of my own voice, a low, steady stream of reassurance. "You're doing good, Private. Just hang on, look at me." I kept my eyes locked on his, a tether holding him to this world. For a moment, I saw not just Dawson, but Miller, and all the other young faces I'd patched together in this godforsaken place. I saw the chasm between this reality and Aliner's world of bake sales and rhododendrons, and it felt infinite. In that moment, crouched in the dust and the din, my hands slick with blood, holding a boy's life together by sheer will, the composure cracked. Not on the outside. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't waver. But inside, a silent, desperate scream echoed through the hollow spaces. It was a plea for this not to be normal. A wish for a world where this kind of courage wasn't necessary. The medal waiting for me at home felt less like an honor and more like a brand, marking me as a citizen of this brutal world, forever separate from the one I had left behind. I didn't look up when Marcus finally reached my side, his face grimed with soot. I just kept my pressure on the wound, my eyes on Dawson's, my internal scream locked behind a wall of duty, waiting for the sound of the evac helicopter that would carry this piece of the war away from me, if only for a little while. The silence of my childhood room was a different kind of enemy. It didn't roar with incoming fire or hum with the distant thrum of generators. This silence was absolute, a heavy woolen blanket smothering the world. It was in this suffocating quiet that the dream found me, not with a bang, but with a sensation, the gritty feel of dust coating my tongue, the coppery scent of blood so real I could taste it. I was back in the dust, the fine, pale dust of the river valley on my knees. Marcus was yelling, but his voice was muffled as if we were both underwater. My hands were slick, not with sweat, but with a warmth that was too thick, too dark. I was applying pressure, searching for a pulse I knew I wouldn't find, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of my own heart the only beat in the universe. Then, a hand on my shoulder shaking me, but it was Marcus's strong, sure grip. It was gentle, hesitant. My eyes snapped open. The darkness of the room was complete, the familiar shapes of my dresser and bookshelf looming like unfamiliar sentinels. The hand on my shoulder was my own, clutching at the sweat-damp cotton of my t-shirt. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive stillness. I focused on the red numerals of the clock on the nightstand. 3:17 a.m. I'd been home for 3 months, but my body still operated on a different time zone, a different reality. I swung my legs out of bed, the floorboards cool against my bare feet. The house was a museum of a life I'd left behind. Every piece of furniture, every faded photograph on the wall, was a relic from before. I padded downstairs, my movements automatic, and filled a glass with water at the kitchen sink. The faucet's drip 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 was an agonizing counterpoint to the phantom thrum of the fob. I stood there for a long time, staring out the window at the empty, sleeping street. This was peace. This was what I was supposed to have fought for, so why did it feel like a cage? A floorboard creaked overhead. Aliner was awake. I could picture her lying in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to me pace. Our dance of avoidance had begun the moment I'd stepped off the bus, a stiff hug, a tear she quickly wiped away, and then a torrent of words about everything except the last 2 years. The state of the garden, the church picnic, the neighbor's new dog. We were 2 ghosts haunting the same house, carefully stepping around the chasm that had opened up between us. The mandatory sessions with Dr. Carter felt like the only place where the air was clear, even if the process of breathing it was painful. His office was calm, beige, and smelled faintly of lemony polish. He never looked at a clock, but I always knew our time was up when the slant of sunlight from the window hit a particular spot on the Persian rug. "The nightmare was the same?" Dr. Carter asked. He sat in his usual chair, a simple leather armchair, his notebook resting on his knee but his attention fully on me. "The same setting, the same sensory details." I didn't need to elaborate. We de-mapped that river valley in meticulous detail over the past few weeks. "And when you woke, what was the primary emotion?" I considered this. For a long time it had been fear, then guilt, now it was something else. "Isolation," I said, the word feeling inadequate. "It's like I'm shouting into a void, but the void is this perfect, quiet house. My grandmother is 20 feet away, and she might as well be on the moon." Dr. Carter nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "You've described Eleanor as a fortress. What is it you want from her, Alara? What does breaching those walls look like to you?" I looked down at my hands, clasped tightly in my lap. They were clean now, the nails neatly trimmed. They didn't look like Medic's hands anymore. "I don't need a parade. I don't even need her to say she's proud. I need her to see me. The whole me, not the girl who left, but the person who came back. I need her to understand that the silence is worse than anything she could possibly say." "Understanding is a high bar," he said gently. "Perhaps we can aim for acknowledgement first, for her to acknowledge the weight you carry. Your need for her to understand, is it perhaps a need for your sacrifice to be validated by the person whose opinion matters most?" The question hung in the air. He had a way of pinpointing the raw nerve with quiet precision. My composure, my greatest asset in a crisis, felt like a brittle shell in this room. "She lost her husband to war," I said, deflecting. "She thinks she's protecting me by not asking, protecting herself." "And are you protecting her by not telling?" The question followed me out of his office and into the strained atmosphere of the dinner Sarah had insisted on. "A girls' night," she chirped on the phone, her voice a blast of cheerful normalcy that felt alien. "You've been hiding away for months. It'll be fun." The restaurant was all warm wood and soft lighting, the kind of place where the biggest drama was a poorly cooked steak. Sarah was already at a table, her face lighting up when she saw me. She looked the same as always, bright, put together, a life lived in a comfortable, predictable arc. We hugged, and for a moment I was 16 again, sharing secrets over milkshakes. "You look great," she said, pulling back to study me. "A little thin, but rest is doing you good." "Thanks," I said, sliding into the booth. "You too." We navigated the initial small talk like skilled diplomats. Her job, my time off, mutual friends from high school who were now married with children. The conversation was a minefield of normalcy, and I stepped carefully. "I still can't believe you did it," she said, shaking her head as she took a sip of her wine. "Just, when over there, I was a nervous wreck watching the news every night." "It wasn't all on the news," I said, my tone carefully neutral. I know, it's just wow, I could never. My biggest adventure was that disastrous camping trip with Mark where it rained the whole time." She laughed, a light, tinkling sound. "Speaking of, you'll never believe what he did for our anniversary." I tried to listen, I really did. But her words started to blur together, the clatter of plates echoing the distant memory of mess hall trays. She was telling a story about a miscommunication with a client, her voice rising in animated frustration. "And I told him, if you want the logo in magenta, that's fine, but it's going to clash horribly with the website palette. It was a complete disaster." She paused, looking at me for commiseration. I must have had a strange look on my face because her smile faltered. What is it?" "Nothing," I said, forcing a smile. "It's just, disaster is a strong word for a color palette." The moment the words left my mouth, I knew it was a mistake. I hadn't meant to sound condescending, but the comparison was so absurd, so wildly disproportionate to the things I had seen, that it just slipped out. Sarah's face cooled instantly. "Well, sorry my life isn't as dramatic as yours, Alara. Not all of us get bronze stars for our troubles." The air went out of me. She didn't say it maliciously, that was the worst part. It was a flippant, offhand comment born of a moment of pique, but it trivialized everything. It reduced the blood, the dust, the weight of the metal tucked away in my closet to a topic of conversational one-upmanship. My composure, for the first time in a very long time, cracked. Not a shattering, but a hairline fracture. I could feel it. You have no idea what you're talking about, Sarah. Oh, come on, she said, defensive now. Don't do that. Don't act like you're the only one who understands hardship. We all have our battles. Do we? My voice was low, dangerously calm. Do we really? Is your battle trying to stop a 19-year-old kid from bleeding out in the dirt? Is it writing a letter to his mother afterward because you were the last person to hear him speak? Tell me, what shade of magenta is that? The table fell silent. Sarah stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and hurt. I had crossed a line. I had brought the storm into this safe, warm room, and I had ruined everything. I think I should go, I said softly, placing my napkin on the table. Elara, wait. But I was already standing, pulling a few bills from my wallet and dropping them on the table. I'm sorry, Sarah. Thank you for dinner. The walk home was a blur of cool night air and stinging eyes. I had wanted understanding from Sarah, just as I did from Alina, and had received only a painful reminder of the gulf that now separated me from the world I'd left behind. I had handled it poorly. A good medic knows when a wound is too contaminated to close. I had forced it, and it had torn wider. Alina was waiting up when I got home, something she'd started doing since my return. She was in her armchair, a book open on her lap, but her reading glasses were perched on the end of her nose, and she wasn't turning pages. You're home early, she said, her voice carefully neutral. It was a short dinner, I replied, hanging my jacket by the door. I could feel her eyes on me, assessing. Everything all right with Sarah? Fine, the word was a wall. I started toward the stairs, desperate for the sanctuary of my room. Elara, her voice stopped me. I turned. She had taken her glasses off and was worrying the stem between her fingers. There's leftover meatloaf if you're hungry. It was such a mundane offering, a token of care wrapped in the language of domesticity. It was her way of saying, I'm here, I'm worried, but it wasn't enough. Not anymore. I'm fine, Graham. I continued up the stairs, the weight of the evening of the last 3 months of the last 2 years pressing down on me. Later, after the house had fallen into its deep silence once more, I knelt on the floor of my closet. Behind a stack of sweaters was a small, lacquered box. I hadn't opened it since the day it was given to me. My hands, which had remained steady through things that would make most people sick, trembled as I lifted the lid. There it lay on its bed of dark velvet, the bronze star. The metal was cool to the touch, surprisingly heavy. It wasn't the weight of the metal itself, but the weight of the memory it carried. I traced the star with my fingertip, the raised center with its tiny, perfect circle, for meritorious service in a combat zone, such sterile language for such a visceral day. I could still see the sun, a white-hot coin in a dusty sky. I could hear the concussive blast, the ringing in my ears that followed, the frantic calls for a medic. I saw Marcus's face, smeared with dirt and sweat, as we worked in tandem, a well-rehearsed ballet of triage and trauma care. The medal wasn't for heroism, it was for endurance, for keeping people alive when the world was intent on tearing them apart. Dr. Carter's voice echoed in my mind. Your need for her to understand? Is it perhaps a need for your sacrifice to be validated by the person whose opinion matters most? He was right. This wasn't just about breaking the silence. It was about offering her the truth, the whole, unvarnished truth, and trusting that her love for me was stronger than her fear of what I had become. I couldn't control her reaction. I could only control my own courage. I closed my fingers around the cool metal, its edges biting into my palm. Tomorrow, I would not hide it away. Tomorrow, I would carry this small, heavy thing downstairs. I would sit across from the woman who had taught me how to tie my shoes and how to be strong, and I would try to explain the cost of the strength she saw in me. The chasm between us was vast, a yawning silence filled with dust and ghosts, but I was a medic. My duty was to heal. And some wounds, I knew, could never begin to close until they were first exposed to the air. The sun was a liar. It streamed through the lace curtains of Alina's kitchen, painting cheerful, dappled patterns on the worn linoleum floor, a stark contrast to the leaden weight in my chest. I'd spent the night in a cage of my own making, the 4 walls of my childhood room pressing in, the silence broken only by the ragged sound of my own breathing and the distant, telling creak of floorboards from Alina's room. She'd heard me. She always heard me. Our dance of avoidance had reached a precipice, and one of us had to step off. I found her at the table, a cup of tea steaming untouched before her, her hands clasped tightly around the ceramic as if for warmth. Her gaze was fixed on the backyard, on the bird feeder where a lone cardinal pecked nervously at the seeds. She looked every one of her 78 years, the morning light carving the lines of worry and loss deeper into her face. "Grandmother," I said, my voice rough from disuse and the lingering phantom taste of dust and blood. She turned, her eyes sweeping over me, taking in the rigid set of my shoulders, the dark circles I couldn't hide. "Ilara, you're up early." It wasn't a question. It was an observation, a piece of data added to the silent ledger she'd been keeping for 2 years. I couldn't sleep. I pulled out the chair opposite her, the scrape of its legs against the floor unnaturally loud in the stillness. I sat, my posture instinctively straight, back rigid, a soldier at attention. The small velvet box in my pocket felt like a lodestone, pulling me down into the earth. We sat in a silence that was thick with everything we didn't say. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a measure of the distance between us. I thought of Marcus, of the way he'd clap me on the shoulder after a triage and say, "Vance, you can't carry the whole damn war in your ruck. It's bad for your posture." I wished for that simplicity now. This was a different kind of triage, and the patient was us. "I need to talk to you," I began, the words feeling foreign and dangerous. Elinor's eyes, the same shade of steel gray as my own, met mine. There was no judgment in them, only a deep, weary caution. "You've always been a woman of few words, Ilara. When you use them, they tend to matter." I took a slow breath, centering myself the way I did before assessing a casualty. Air in, air out, compartmentalize, but this wasn't a wound I could tourniquet. This was the source of the bleed. My fingers closed around the box. I placed it on the table between us, the simple dark velvet a stark anomaly on the familiar, flower-patterned tablecloth. "I was awarded this," I said, my voice flat clinical, "a Bronze Star." Her hands, still wrapped around her teacup, went very still. Her knuckles were white. She didn't look at the box. She kept her eyes locked on mine, and in their depths I saw the ghost of another war, another notification, another medal that had arrived in a different box, for a man who never came home. Her husband, my grandfather, a ghost that had shaped my entire childhood. "For valor," she said, the words barely a whisper. "For actions in a river valley, about 18 months into my deployment." I didn't open the box. The medal itself was less important than the story it represented. It was a key, and I was finally going to use it to unlock the door we'd both kept bolted shut. I began to talk. The words didn't come easily at first. They were rusty, reluctant things, shaped by official reports and the sterile language of after-action reviews. I told her about the heat, a physical weight that pressed the air from your lungs. I described the dust, a fine, red talcum that coated everything, your skin, your teeth, the inside of your eyelids. I told her about the outpost, a collection of mud brick buildings clinging to the side of a valley, and the river, a brown, sluggish snake at the bottom, which was the reason we were there at all. "We were setting up a temporary aid station," I explained, my gaze drifting from her face to the window, seeing not the tidy lawn but the harsh, sun-bleached landscape of my memory. "A joint operation. Sergeant Thorne Marcus was with me. We had a squad of infantry providing security." I could feel the tension radiating from Elinar, but she didn't interrupt. She just listened, her breathing shallow. Then I told her about the sound. The unmistakable, world-ending crack of RPGs, the staccato rhythm of machine gun fire. The controlled chaos of the initial response, the shouts of the squad leader, the return of fire. My world shrank to the basics: tourniquets, gauze, the metallic smell of blood, the feel of a radial pulse under my slick fingers. We had 2 casualties almost immediately, one with a leg nearly severed, the other with a sucking chest wound. My voice lost its clinical edge, becoming softer, more visceral. I was working on the second one, sealing the wound with an occlusive dressing, when the call came over the radio. They were falling back. The position was compromised. We had to move, and we had to move now. I paused, my throat tight. This was the part I'd never said aloud to anyone, not even in my debrief with Dr. Carter. This was the heart of the nightmare. "We started the evacuation," I continued, my words measured. "Carrying the wounded down the steep slope toward the river where the extraction point was. The air was thick with smoke and the tang of cordite. The insurgents had the high ground. They were picking us apart. I looked down at my hands resting on the table. They were clean now, but in my mind they were still stained. Marcus was carrying the rear, providing cover fire. He was always the rock, joking even then, telling me to stop dragging my feet. A faint, painful smile touched my lips and vanished. We were almost to the riverbank when I heard it. A different sound, not the crack of a rifle, but a heavier, deeper thump. Mortar. The memory washed over me, not as a flashback, but as a full sensory immersion. The deafening explosion, the concussive wave that slammed into my chest, the rain of dirt and rock. The world went white, then black, then a dizzying, ringing gray. It hit the slope above us. The ground just gave way. My voice dropped to a whisper. I was thrown forward. When I could see again, when the ringing in my ears subsided enough to hear the screams, I saw that the path behind me was gone. A section of the hill had collapsed into the river. And Marcus was gone with it. I finally looked at Alina. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. But her eyes were on me, unwavering. She was still listening. The current was fast, I said, the words coming faster now, tumbling out. Chocolate brown with churned-up silt. I saw his ruck first, then an arm. He was struggling, but the weight of his gear was pulling him under. I didn't think. There was no thought. I just moved. I slid down the remaining bank and into the water. I described the shocking cold of the river, the brutal force of the current grabbing me, trying to tear me away. The struggle to reach him, my muscles burning, my lungs screaming. The feeling of my fingers finally closing on the strap of his body armor, the desperate, impossible fight to drag him, a dead weight against the pull of the water, toward the opposite shore. I got him to a muddy bank, I said, my voice cracking. He was unconscious. There was so much blood. It was coming from his head, from a gash on his temple where a rock must have hit him. My hands clenched into fists on the table. I got him out of the water. I started working on him. Airway, breathing, circulation. I was doing everything right, everything by the book, but the blood, it just kept coming. My gauze was gone, my compresses were soaked through. I was using my hands, applying direct pressure, talking to him, begging him to hold on. Tears I didn't know I'd been holding back began to well in my eyes, blurring the image of my grandmother's face. I could hear the firefight continuing on the other side of the river. I was alone with him on that bank, and I knew, I'm a medic, grandmother, I know the signs. I felt his pulse get thready under my fingers. I saw the color leave his face. And there was nothing I could do. Nothing. I let the silence hang there, heavy and suffocating. The cardinal at the feeder had flown away. The kitchen was utterly still. The evacuation helicopter found us maybe 10 minutes later, I finished, the fight gone from my voice. They loaded him up. They loaded me up. He was pronounced dead before we reached the base hospital. I took a shaky breath. They said I showed extraordinary heroism, that I risked my life to save his against impossible odds. They gave me the medal for that, for valor. I finally reached out and flipped open the velvet box. The star gleamed dully in the morning light, a cold, hard piece of metal that represented the hottest, most chaotic, most devastating moments of my life. But I don't feel like a hero, I whispered, my composure finally fracturing. I feel like I failed Marcus, and every day since I've carried that river with me. The cold, the noise, the feeling of his life bleeding out between my fingers, that's what I brought home, that's why I've been absent. I fell silent, exhausted, my confession hanging in the air between us. I had shown her my wound, raw and unbandaged. I waited for her to speak, to offer some platitude, to retreat behind her wall of stoic disapproval. But Alina didn't speak. Her eyes, which had been fixed on mine with an almost painful intensity, slowly lowered to the metal. She stared at it for a long time, her face unreadable. I saw her gaze trace the points of the star, the ribbon. Then, her eyes lifted again, but they didn't stop at my face. They traveled over me, really seeing me for the first time since I'd returned home. They saw the new lines around my eyes, the tension in my jaw, the way I held myself like I was still expecting an explosion. She wasn't looking at Captain Vance, Bronze Star recipient. She was looking at Alara, the little girl she'd raised, the woman who was forever changed. A single, slow tear traced a path through the fine wrinkles on her cheek. Then another. Her stern facade, the armor she'd worn for decades, forged in her own loss, crumbled completely. Her chin trembled and a quiet, broken sound escaped her lips. She pushed her chair back from the table, the legs scraping against the floor. She rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She simply walked around the table, her steps firm on the linoleum, and stopped beside my chair. I looked up at her, my own tears now falling freely. I saw no judgment in her eyes, no disappointment, no fear. I saw only a profound, gut-wrenching understanding, and a love so fierce it eclipsed everything else. She leaned down, her hands, gnarled with arthritis but still strong, reaching for me. She didn't pat my shoulder or offer a stiff, formal hug. She wrapped her arms around me and pulled me into her, folding my head against her soft, familiar-smelling chest. It was the embrace she'd given me when I'd fallen off my bike and scraped my knees, when I'd been heartbroken after my first real breakup, when I'd left for basic training, a lifetime ago. It was the embrace of home. And I broke. The 2 years of silence, of compartmentalization, of holding the line against the memories, collapsed. I clung to her, my shoulders shaking with sobs I didn't even know I had left in me. She held me tighter, her own body trembling, her tears falling into my hair. We wept together for Marcus, for the grandfather I'd never known, for the 2 years we'd lost, for the pain we'd both endured in our separate silences. It was a storm of grief and release, and in the heart of it there were no words. None were necessary. Her arms around me said everything. I see you. I know your pain. I am here. You are home. I don't know how long we stayed like that. It felt like an eternity and no time at all. When the storm finally began to subside, leaving me hollowed out but clean, like a landscape after a hard rain, she still held me. She rested her cheek on the top of my head and let out a long, shuddering sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades. Finally, she spoke, her voice raspy with emotion, but clear and firm. My brave, foolish, beautiful girl. She pulled back slightly, cupping my face in her hands, her thumbs wiping the tears from my cheeks. Her eyes, red-rimmed and shining, held mine. All this time, I was so afraid of losing you like I lost him. I thought if I built the walls high enough, I could keep the war out. But it was already inside, and you were carrying it alone. I shook my head, fresh tears welling. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I could. Hush, she said, her tone gentle but final. You have nothing to be sorry for, nothing. She looked past me, toward the window, her gaze turning inward. My John, he was a good man, a brave man, but his war, it was different. He wrote me letters. He told me about the rain, the mud, the friends he'd made. He never told me about the rivers. She looked back at me, a new, fierce light in her eyes. You told me about the river. She released my face and slowly, deliberately, closed the velvet box containing the metal. She pushed it gently to the side, clearing the space between us. It was no longer the center of our universe. I was. A woman's place, she said softly, almost to herself. She shook her head, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. For my whole life I believed it was here, holding the fort, keeping the home fires burning. She reached out and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. But a woman's place is wherever her strength is needed. Your strength, your compassion, that's what I raised you with. And you took it to the one place it was needed most. I was too blind, too scared to see that. 3 days later, I was in the backyard, pulling stubborn weeds from her rose bushes. The sun was warm on my back, a genuine warmth this time, not the accusatory glare of that first morning. The earthy smell of soil was a grounding, real scent that pushed back the phantom odors of dust and blood. The back door opened and closed. Alina walked out, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed one to me, her movements easy, unburdened. The Queen Elizabeths are coming in nicely, she said, nodding toward the cluster of pale pink roses near the fence. They are, I agreed, taking a sip of the cold, sweet tea. It tasted of mint and lemon, a taste of pure, uncomplicated peace. We stood in a comfortable silence for a few moments, watching a bumblebee drone lazily from bloom to bloom. Sarah called while you were out here, Alina said casually. She invited you to that baby shower for her cousin next weekend. She said you haven't responded to her texts. I felt a familiar twinge of guilt. Sarah, with her Pinterest boards and her settled life, represented a path I hadn't taken, a normality that felt alien to me. The chasm between us had felt too wide to cross. I'll call her back, I said, and for the first time I meant it. It wasn't a chore, it was a possibility. Alina nodded, satisfied. She didn't offer advice or push. She simply stood beside me, a solid, quiet presence. She reached out and brushed a stray leaf from my shoulder, her hand resting there for a moment. It wasn't the crushing, cathartic embrace of our kitchen table reckoning. It was something softer, more sustainable. A simple touch that said, "I am here. We are here together." I looked from the roses to her face, softened by the sunlight, and felt a shift deep inside, a settling of a foundation I'd thought was permanently cracked. The war wasn't gone. The memories weren't erased. But the silence was, and in its place was something new, something fragile but growing, rooted not in fear, but in the hard-won ground of truth.